Hi, everyone. Hello. Good afternoon or early evening, depending on where you are connecting from. We are going to start this webinar in a few seconds. As I see that the room is filling up. Hello again. Good afternoon. I think we're going to start now. And I know we're going to have more people to come, so they might miss the introduction, but we'll join for the presentation, which is way more important. I wanted to welcome you to this Today Research Talk webinar. My name is Alia Verloes, and I'm an associate at Steer. I oversee our North American New Mobility team and work. And despite my French accent, I'm based in our New York office. Over the years, I've had the privilege of working on a numerous projects related to shared mobility and micromobility, both in Europe and in North America, collaborating with communities, policymakers, academics, and private operators. So today's webinar topic is very dear to my heart because it's one of the key issue or challenges that cities are facing with these new programs. If you have joined us for other events in this series before, you'll know that Steer is very thrilled to be partnering with the Active Travel Academy at the University of Westminster with the aim of empowering active travel practitioners by making academic research more accessible. And throughout the series, we've been exploring 3 pivotal studies in active travel from authors across 3 continents. We're also supporting the development of reader-friendly summaries for each of the research papers featured in the series, and they will help you to grasp key insight within 10 minutes or so. So for each of you who are used to typically navigating very long academic papers, we really believe that it will help you save some time. With accessibility in mind, these publications are also in, well, I guess English first, but French, Spanish, Chinese, and Arabic. And tomorrow you will all receive an email with the recording of the session to help you revisit and reflect on the discussion that we are going to have today with Nick. So without further ado, let me introduce you to Nicolas Klein, an associate professor at the Department of the City and Regional Planning in the College of Architecture, Art and Planning at Cornell University. Before we go to Nick, I wanted to let you know that we will have an Q&A session after the session. So you are more than welcome to start thinking about your questions. You can type them into the comment box that you should find on the top right hand side of your screen. And we will attempt to answer as many as we can during the time that we have together today. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Nick to find out more about some of the key insight of his research.
Thanks so much. And thanks everyone for attending. I'm very excited to be here presenting. Let me start my presentation. Oh, there we go. Thank you, David. So thanks again for everyone at Steer and Active Travel Academy for hosting this talk today and for helping disseminate this research. I'm very excited to have my research be a little more accessible. It's something I think all of us want in academia to get work out there. So thank you very much for attending and to all the staff who put this together behind the scenes. So I want to start today, I'm going to be talking primarily about this paper, which is the subject of the talk, but I want to situate it in a sort of longer term horizon, what we did before and where we're going after. So I'll start with a little bit of background. And I also want to acknowledge my co-authors and co-conspirators in this work, Dr. Ann Brown, who's at the University of Oregon, and Dr. Calvin Thigpen, who's at Lyme. We've been working together for several years on trying to understand parking and micromobility. So let's just dive in with a little bit of background. A few years ago, Ann and Calvin and I began working on this research project by trying to get a handle on the issue of scooter misparking. We knew there were a lot of complaints about it, but there was very little data about how common it was. So we set about doing a field survey in 5 US cities, sending out students for several days in busy commercial areas to record every scooter and bike and assess whether each one was misparked, right? Meaning they were impeding other people's travel. And we can probably have a long conversation later on about what counts as misparking. But we were really concerned about folks with limited mobility and trying to understand and handle complaints. And so students went out there with clipboards, marking down every single scooter they had. They took photos of them. And they also had measuring tape to sort of measure how much space was left over. And what we found, right, these are the rates of misparking of scooters across every city, as we found very little misparking. And we also assessed the share of motor vehicles, or the frequency at which motor vehicles were misparked, meaning double parked cars and buses and trucks and ride-hail vehicles and delivery vehicles that were blocking a crosswalk, blocking a bus stop, like I said, double parked, or some other way impeding access. And we found that they were much more common and much more likely to be impeding other people's travels. So this was sort of the start of our research. And we were left with sort of a funny feeling, right? On the one hand, we had our findings, which showed just very low rates of scooter misparking, but a disconnect between public perceptions that this was a big problem, that people believed scooter misparking was happening all the time. So I want to talk a little bit today about the studies in this paper that get at that issue, that try and understand those rates of misparking. And so I want to start by talking about 2 parts of this paper. It's really 2 studies within one paper. And the first part of this, the first part looks at evaluating 3 different parking interventions, and the second part looks at perceptions of scooter parking, right? So I'll start with study 1. So we know that cities all across the world are looking at different ways to regulate scooter parking, to manage scooter parking, to think about what they can do. But we have very little information about what works. And we sought to test 3 different common approaches in 2 very different contexts to see what works. And so we were looking at observations that we did, data we collected, again, sending out students and other research assistants in Auckland, New Zealand, and Washington, D.C. to go collect data, places with pretty robust micromobility usage, with a long-ish history of micromobility, where we and others had done previous research, and we could feasibly do research during this time. And so we collected data in 2021. In both cities, we focused on busy commercial areas where we knew there was heavy scooter usage, and also we expected that there would be prime locations for conflicts and complaints. And so first what we did is we set out and did baseline observations in each city, hiring these students to go out on Thursday, a Friday, and Saturday for about 5 hours each day. And again, research was recording every scooter and noting the parking details and snapping a photo of it. This time, instead of clipboards, we had them doing little data collections on a little survey we had on their phones. And the first thing we did after our baseline observations was a common thing that cities do, which is to test the efficacy of in-app messages, right? So when you're using one of these apps, it's a little message that reminds you about proper parking behavior, and how it's important, and different ways. It gives advice about how to park according to local regulations. The second intervention was we installed decals on the sidewalk in the study area, about 100 to 200 meters from an on-street parking corral, encouraging people to park in these corrals. And then these decals also pointed them in the direction of the closest on-street corral. So it's trying to think about what kinds of small interventions, what kind of lightweight interventions, relatively cheap ones, can cities do to try and address parking, to give people insights. Maybe people don't know where to park. And lastly, our survey, our sort of data collection coincided with Washington, D.C. passing a new citywide regulation that would require all scooters to be equipped with a locking mechanism, and that users would be required to lock them to some sort of bike rack or street furniture. And so in the interest of time, I'm just going to focus on the headline findings, right? So using the in-app messaging and sidewalk decals had little effect on scooter parking in either city. Unsurprisingly, what we found is that, so here's the rates of, the baseline rates for the misparking and then for the Lock 2 regulation. So messages and sidewalk decals didn't have much effect, but Lock 2 had a substantial effect, shifting where people park their scooters. We evaluated several different aspects about where scooters and how they might be misparked. First, we looked at whether they were impeding pedestrian access, particularly for folks with disabilities. Then we looked at whether they were misparked according to the local regulations, which can vary by city to city, right? I'm sure you're well aware. One city might allow parking next to a building, another city might not. Some allow parking next to bike racks, some do not. So we looked at these according to the local regulations. Again, we had higher rates of misparking when we used this measure. We also looked at whether scooters were parked in the middle of the sidewalk or footpath, which is a common complaint. And where on the sidewalk they were located, right? Whether they were located in what's called the furniture zone, the location sort of abutting the street where you'd imagine if people still sold newspapers, there might be a newspaper stand there or a mailbox and so forth, or a bench. And we also, so I would urge, so one of the things I think about, when we look at this is we see some big shifts and we see a big effect of Lock 2. More recently, cities have trended to go away from Lock 2 requirements and started using more GPS managed mandatory parking areas. We see that being much more common, and we haven't tested that yet, but with this type of observation, but we've done some other observations using larger data sets, and we see a big effect from those as well. Right, so this is one of the things we started to do. We're trying to understand where are people parking and what can we do about it. The second study, which I think is going to be the focus, it is the focus of the short brief, and what I want to spend more time talking about is trying to understand how people think about scooter parking. How do we understand it? What are the common conceptions of it? How do people frame it? What do the public think counts as misparking? And so first we asked the public to estimate rates of misparking in their city. We did this in DC and in Auckland. We had students intercept people on the street when we had them ask, what percentage of scooters are parked improperly, even very briefly, right? And what we found is that in both cities, respondents reported that a high rates of misparking, or that misparking is very common, right? So we see here that in DC, more than 30% of people think that, more than 50% of people think that more than 30% of scooters are misparked. In Auckland, we see that, roughly 45% or 40% of people think that 30% of scooters are misparked, right? This is much higher than what we observed, right? So we observe very low rates of misparking, but people think it's very common. Even if we look at sort of the rates of violating local regulations, right? People are still vastly overestimating how much misparking is happening. And, I'm guessing that many of you are transportation professionals, right? When we've done surveys like this, when we've done webinars like this or done other outreach, we've often used a question like this. I didn't do it today, but we often include a question about sort of how common do transportation professionals think that this is, right? How common do they think that misparking is? And what we found is that even transportation professionals overestimate the share of misparking, right? They think it's happening all the time. Many of them, so we found that sort of the median transportation professional thinks that 20 to 30% of scooters are improperly parked, and nearly half think that over 30% are misparked. Right, so it's very common for people to think that scooter parking is happening. And again, we still are stuck with this disconnect between what we observe when we do careful studies with students going out there with measuring tape, taking photos, marking every scooter, versus what the public thinks is happening. So we tried to figure out this and think about this, to think about what counts as good versus bad parking. And to do this, we did a survey where we showed survey respondents a series of 10 parking scenarios. Here's just 6 of them on here, but to give you an illustration of what we're asking, what we have people do. And some of these scenarios are clearly problems, right? So a scooter tipped over, right? I think most people agree that that's a problematic and is improperly parked. And similarly, one that's parked in the middle of the sidewalk impeding people's travel, right? People, we can agree, think that that's improper parking. But other scenarios, right, highlight different aspects of how people might park. they highlight different degrees of what we might think of as tidiness or messiness, right? So the scooters highlighted here in these two images are all going to be parked according to local regulations. They're all okay in how they're parked, right? One is just, none of them impede people's travel. They're in the furniture zone. They're away from where anyone might be. But one of them is messy and the other one is tidy, right? And we were suspicious that this might be one of the many things that people are noticing about how scooters are parking that might lead them to think that more scooters are misparked than should be. And so we asked people in our survey, in your view, are these scooters parked properly? Or we asked them, in your view, do these scooters clutter the street, right? Trying to think about these two sort of dimensions, parking properly versus improperly, and cluttered and not cluttered. And we randomly assigned different people to see these different questions. And other survey, we had people answer both questions just to tease out the effects of whether people might be answering them differently in some way or answering them in the same way. And so I'll show you the results of this. And I'm going to graph them. And for each scenario, we'll plot them according to whether respondents, on average, thought that they were more or less parked properly on the X and Y axis, or whether they were more or less cluttered, right? So on the left-hand side, we would say more likely to be viewed these scooters are cluttered, and on the right-hand side, not viewed as cluttered. And so when we plot these 10 different scenarios we had, we find that people tend to think of proper parking as a function of both accessibility and tidiness, right? So people are sort of thinking about, does this impede people's travel? Does this get in the people's way? But also, how tidy is this? How messy is this? And we can see here, I want to highlight these two differences, right? These ones I highlighted earlier, these same examples, which are alike except in the orientation of the scooters, right? And it seems from our research that the public definition of improper parking tends to focus on these two aspects, accessibility and tidiness. Untidy or cluttered scooters might be accounting for some large portion of the gap between what we observe, right, where we observe scooters being parked in a way that doesn't impede people's travel, that seems like it's no problem, there's plenty of space for people to get around, and yet a public perception that there are tons of scooters misparked all over the place, that people crowd scooters all around, and that the scooter parking is a huge problem among both the public and also among transportation professionals. And so from this survey, I want to sort of have three quick takeaways. And then I'll talk about other work we're doing, and we can open it up for questions after that. So first, policy discussions about scooter parking need to start from a place of shared understanding, namely what counts as improper parking, right? Or what counts as proper parking. I think often we have these discussions where the public might be thinking of and imagining scooter parking as being tidy, as being out of the way of access. But when we write regulations, we often write regulations that focus on one aspect of this, like where is it parked, not sort of the tidiness about this. Second, public perceptions of improper parking are often driven by concerns about pedestrian accessibility and this aesthetic sense of tidiness and order, right? So that people are deciding and thinking about scooter parking and to other micromobility parking, right? And they're thinking about it in a way that's different from sort of when we write regulations. We think when we write regulations, we should write ones that make the parking rules clear and obvious and intuitive, right? It should be obvious to people where they should park and how they should park, and that it should be clear about what counts as proper parking, right? And so we see, and when we've seen this in our research in different cities, like for example, one city that doesn't allow scooters to be parked at a bike rack, which is a very common place where lots of people would think that they are allowed to park it. And then lastly, cities should provide more physical infrastructure to park micromobility vehicles, both shared and privately owned, right? And we have lots of thoughts about where that should be, but we think cities should be providing more space and saying where that space is and making it really clear and obvious to riders. So I want to now turn a little bit to additional scooter research we're doing and scooter parking research, which I think builds on a lot of this. So first, I'll just point out that the other paper that I mentioned at the beginning is this one on PD access. I can post a link to that. That is, and all our research is open access and available for people to read. But here's that first study. I'll put that in there. This is the one I mentioned before that compares sort of scooter parking in 5 different cities and with automobile parking. More recently, we've published a report with Urbanism Next Center as part of the State of Oregon. It looks at the question of how much parking do you need and how dense should it be? And so this report is really using a larger data set. We did data looking at many cities across the world and using data from micromobility partners to look at questions of where people are parking and how dense does it have to be. And what we find from this is that without frequent parking opportunities, parking compliance fails, right? So this is looking at mandatory parking zones and how dense they should be. And we find that cities should provide parking locations every 200 meters or at least 25 parking locations per square kilometers so that riders are always within 1 minute of parking, right? So again, thinking about like, how do we send signals to people on micromobility devices about where they should park and how do we make it easy for them? And one of the ways we do that is by making those opportunities plentiful and easy to access. So here's a link to that report. So we also have a new report that's going to be coming out soon from Urbanism Next, which is looking at what this type of parking should be, right? So how should cities go about doing this? This is based on interviews we've done with micromobility managers at cities in North America and Europe and in Australia, thinking about how can cities provide the necessary parking locations and how can cities build that parking in a way that addresses other considerations, whether it's cost effectiveness or traffic safety, and sort of getting into the nitty gritty of like, where should you put scooter parking on a street and how should you organize it? How should you develop that? What are the materials you can use? Where are some resources you can use to access that? So that's going to be coming out soon. And that's, I think, a report that'll be very useful. And then lastly, work that we're beginning to develop now is looking at, again, this question of trying to understand this disconnect between people's perceptions and what we observe. And so we're doing an online survey experiment to really look at sort of one of the questions we have is whether there's a sort of a bias against scooters, which would look at the question of like, you know, if we look at similar scenarios like this bike and the scooter, do people view them differently based on the vehicle type? Are people more likely to assume a scooter is improperly parked, or sorry, to rate a scooter as improperly parked compared to a very similarly parked bicycle, or perhaps a sandwich board advertising a restaurant, or a construction sign that's out there, or in some cases, a car that's parked blocking some sidewalk access, right? So thinking about how scooters, where their bias ranks and how their bias lines up. Also thinking about sort of in our survey, who is biased against scooters? Are there certain people who are more likely to be based on bias? Maybe it's by scooter usage. So if you've never used a scooter, are you more likely to view the scooter in this image as more likely to be improperly parked versus someone who's a frequent scooter usage? And then lastly, how does this affect policy preferences, right? So does this lead to people thinking we should ban scooters, as some cities have done, or to issue tickets and fines to scooter riders, or to provide more parking spaces for scooters? So thinking about and teasing out those issues. And so that's sort of where this work is going. So I'll end there, and I'm happy to answer as many questions as people have. I tried to keep it light and breezy and focus on the findings. Again, thank you to everyone here for attending and for coming with questions, and I really appreciate it, the opportunity to talk about the work.
Thanks a lot, Nick. Really appreciate this presentation and how you went into like the key insight. And I'm sure we'll be able to deep dive into some of the elements during the Q&A session that we're going to have now in a minute. Before we deep dive into this part, I also obviously wanted to thank you all for joining us for this webinar series on behalf of STEER and the Active Travel Academy. We really hope that this type of format is really drawing attention to you on the valuable aspect of academic research that is being done, specifically in the sphere and areas of active travel, and how the level of information that is being produced can be more accessible for you. Obviously, a special thanks to the Academy for choosing to work with us here on this vision. Before I miss talking about it, and I always like to do that before the end of a session, I wanted to make sure that you all know that you will have access to all the recordings on our website, steergroup.com. And also don't forget to check out the Academy's research journal, activetravelstudies.org. It's going to be in the recap email we'll send you, which is completely free to access and contains a lot of valuable research across walking, wheeling, cycling to help you design and deliver more effective, inclusive projects. Finally, we are completing today the first iteration of this partnership we have with Active Travel Academy. So we'd love to hear your feedback as to whether you would like to see more content from us in the future, what themes you'd like us to deep dive into. So please take a few minutes to provide your feedback. We'll probably will have a form or something similar once you receive our email. So let's go back to your question, Nick. And I think I'd like to start with chatting a little bit about perception before taking some of the questions that we have already received from our audience. And I would like to go back to one of the key points that you mentioned at the beginning of your key insight. And it is related to the fact that, and I find that really fascinating for someone who has worked for the past 10 years in shared micromobility, helping cities and private operators there. The difference between how people estimate the percentage of shared scooters being improperly parked and your field observation, and the fact that through your analysis, you've also noticed that this difference of estimation is shared by transportation professionals who are also overestimating the improper parking rates. So with that in mind, I guess my first question to you is, why do you think this perception gap exists? And what do you think the implication of that perception gap can have on how practitioners plan, regulate, and implement shared mobility programs?
Thanks so much. I think it's a really good question. And obviously, it's at the heart of, I think, a lot of the work we're doing is trying to understand that. I wish I knew that the one answer, right? Like the one quick thing you could do to fix this public perception. I think there's a number of things that are happening. And so I probably can't name all of them, and I won't name all of them, right? So one is the work we presented here, which is this mismatch of sort of what counts as parking, right? Or what counts as proper parking or improper parking. That there are different definitions people hold in their head about what counts, and maybe it's about cleanliness, tidiness, right? And accessibility. That could be one thing. I think also, right, there's a real challenge that people are bad at, everyone is bad at estimating things that are infrequent, right? So when asked mathematically to estimate something that is not that common, people often overestimate it, right? That's a known bias that everyone has and has nothing to do with scooters. I think thirdly, that there is a lot of talk about scooter problems and scooter perceptions, scooter clutter, right? And scooter misparking. And that is, there's sort of, we'll call it, maybe three big things that tends to get attention in scooters, right? Unsafe riding, whether that's on the sidewalk or some other way, public health worries, right? So people are worried about crashes, and then parking problems. And so I think that, lots of transportation professionals have gotten calls or hear about complaints about scooter problems, right? And so that's something that is, I won't say normalized, but happens quite a bit. And then in the public discourses, right, there are media analyses that talk about this, that this is something that media talks about as well. And right, we saw this a long time ago, well, not a long time ago, but when bike share sort of blew up, the wave of dockless bike share sort of became very popular. We saw big pictures of piles of bicycles, or later on piles of scooters, parked in different places. And so I think that sort of anchored in people's minds as well. One thing that we haven't been able to look at in this yet, but we sort of have talked a lot about, is we're really focused on sort of downtown commercial areas as a place where we're looking, and where we're sort of expecting the most conflicts, because that's where lots of scooters end up being used. There's high places for destinations and trip generators, right? But there's something that we haven't been able to sort of tease out, which is sort of like the scooters that are parked in residential areas, right? In many cities, if you look at the regulations, it is much harder to find a place where you can park it according to local regulations in a residential area, right? There may be sidewalks with private property, and no sort of public space where it makes sense to park a scooter. And so it may be that scooter misparking is much more common in residential areas, right? Or happens not in common in terms of the number of scooters that are misparked, but the likelihood that a scooter is misparked.
Mm-hmm.
And then lastly, we haven't sort of teased out the duration, right? So a misparked scooter, we might be counting it as one scooter, and it's there for a very long time, right? We've done our due diligence to not count that scooter multiple times, but maybe those scooters that are misparked are sort of standing out there for a long time, knocked over in some way that are influencing people sort of mentally more so. It's a neat, I don't know, from an academic perspective, it's a neat problem that gets at both psychology and transportation, but it's also a challenging problem. Does that answer the question?
It does answer the question, and I think I'm going to stay on that one because some of the audience is actually asking questions that are related to mine. But just a thought I was having when you were talking about more suburban residential parking, I know that with the new buzzword of mobility hubs, where micromobility parking is going to be one part or key component of it. It's one of the questions that cities are asking, especially right now in North America. Someone asked a question related to whether you have specifically discussed, interview, survey people with disability while doing this work, and whether you have seen specific insight related to their perception.
So not explicitly as part of the research. We have had some discussions with people as part of designing our research and to sort of understand questions we should be asking. One of the takeaways we sort of heard from this is that to sort of not make assumptions about some sort of universal needs that people have, not universal, but standard needs that people have in terms of space and accessibility and ways of navigating the sidewalk. But I think that is sort of one of the huge groups that that is really concerned about this issue, right? So for me, as someone who's able-bodied, scooter blocking a sidewalk is not a great inconvenience, right? I can move it, I can put it back. I'm more, because this is what I study, I'll probably take a picture of it and then I'll put it upright. But it's easy for me to fix that or get around for that. And for someone else, it could sort of make that sidewalk or that street sort of inaccessible. So I think that is an area that is more work should be done. And we've sort of been in some conversations about that, but it's not a huge part of our research to date.
Okay, that's interesting. And I see that someone else in the chat, Kevin, mentioned that the RNIB, representing blind and partially sighted people, did some studies around 5 years ago in the UK and pulled users for their forum. So maybe just something to have in mind as well. Still on this sort of topic of perception, there's another question from the audience related to whether you were able to say anything about how perception vary between different groups like pedestrians, cyclists, car drivers, van operators, truck operators, etc.
That's a good question. Not all those groups, and not all of them yet. So that's part of what we're trying to do, is trying to understand some of that in that survey work I'm talking about. But what we have seen is that in other work, which I didn't talk about here, when we surveyed people and asked them about sort of the frequency at which they see all sorts of problems related to micromobility, whether that's misparked vehicles or unsafe riding or riding on the sidewalk or something else, we see a big difference between micromobility users and non-users. And sort of the more likely you are, the more you've used micromobility devices, the less likely you are to see the problems. The less you use the devices, the more likely you are to see problems and report problems associated with them. But we haven't looked at all those different groupings, I don't think. I mean, obviously not all of them, but I think it would be neat to look at, many of those different people, how people identify, right? So people identify mostly as drivers versus bicyclists and other operators. But yeah, it'd be great to do.
Mm-hmm. And I guess already having the sort of like viewpoint from user, non-user, and the frequency of use would already provide you a bit of a perspective there. Another question, still on perception and on measurement, and then I'll go. There's a few questions related to parking, so I'll just gather them together. Nathan Pop, who I believe used to work for Steer a long time ago, ask you specifically, what are the best ways to measure proper, improper parking? Any other option besides student with clipboards?
Nathan, you can email me and Anne and Calvin. I know you have our emails because we've talked and worked with you before. But yeah, and other people can reach out. So we have what we've developed, and I think they're available online. And if not, I can make sure or find where they point you to them. We did also, after doing clipboards, which we found was useful, but we ended up switching to a Qualtrics survey. And I think we actually developed a Google form version of it as well, for students to go out and collect the data, or for anyone to go out and collect the data. And we have scripts to analyze it at some level, though you might have to tailor them to meet your needs. But yeah, so we found that using the surveys was a little bit easier. Using the online surveys, people could just go through and walk around and collect the data and take a picture. And yeah, the forms are available. I can find them if you reach out to me. I didn't bring those links.
Fantastic. And Mark, I know you have a few questions that I'm going together with, I guess, my second big question, which is more related to, I guess, the bike infrastructure. I think there's a different point in your research that are suggesting that physical bike infrastructure can have a significant influence in parking behavior. And I guess, given the limited urban space in cities, and I really appreciate the difference between urban realm in Europe and versus the US versus Australia, as well as the competing priorities that cities have to face, how would you make the case for dedicating more physical space to micromobility parking? And do you have any best practice? I think someone in the chat mentioned that, or asked a question about whether providing diagonal parking spaces could help. Just curious about your views on that.
Yeah. So quickly on the diagonal one, I think Grand Rapids or Grand Junction, I forget which one, Grand Junction, I think, has done some work with diagonal parking spaces, and Denver has done a bunch of stuff with and really good examples of sort of finding spaces to fit micromobility in throughout the city, and sort of finding little niches. I mean, I think in the report that's coming out, the Urbanism Next one on sort of how to do parking, that's really where we're going into those details. And I think one thing to think about, and one sort of, I think, promising area is to sort of combine daylighting of street corners with on-street micromobility hub. I think there's a lot of sort of co-benefits there for visibility and safety for pedestrians and cyclists and micromobility users, and also providing on-street parking. So it sort of gets the parking off the sidewalk and onto the street, and it doesn't have to be a lot of infrastructure. I think there's really good examples that we've seen, and in that report from Paris and Denver and elsewhere where cities have done that. I think anytime anyone is trying to take space away from cars is a political challenge. I think that's not an easy one to do, but I think somewhere where you can think about the co-benefits of this could make it somewhat easier sell.
I appreciate that as well. And I think Mark had a question a bit earlier about whether you could clarify what you mean by lock two.
Yeah. So
as well. Just
thank you for asking. So some cities, San Francisco, Washington, D.C., I think Chicago, have required that micromobility operators include a lock on them that that users can lock the vehicle, or they're required to lock the vehicle to something, a street post or a bike rack, or something like that. And so that's a lock to requirement. I should note that last time I went to Washington, D.C., lots of the scooters were not locked to anything. So I think that, as with anything, right, regulations need to be monitored and evaluated, and to make sure that they're still being useful and don't need to be changed.
That's a fair point. I think when I was gathering some questions, there's one from Dom Smith that I did not ask you. It's going a little bit back into, I guess, perception, but you could also treat it from a perspective of just bike infrastructure and cities in general. And I do have my views on that as well, I guess, as someone who has lived in different European cities and now in New York. Did you find any evidence of differences in attitude between cities with more or less supportive active travel cultures? So with the extreme of, giving you the example of Copenhagen, in Copenhagen being more maybe likely to perceive scooter parking as okay versus cities where active travel is less embedded?
That's a great question. We have not looked at differences sort of by what we call mobility culture. I've had a lot of conversations with Anne Brown, my colleague, and Calvin and I this past couple of months. Anne is in the Netherlands. And we've had a lot of conversations about attitudes towards scooters there and versus elsewhere. But we haven't done research on it. And I think it's a really good sort of area to explore.
Mm-hmm. And just reflecting on what you were saying at the end of your presentation and sort of the upcoming studies, I think that's going to be quite a key point, the bias that people can have on specifically scooter versus bike. I think it is something that we, for example, are finding in Paris, and that has led to the situation that Paris is now in, where scooter are not anymore, shared scooter are not anymore in the city. So I would not be surprised if cities that have a more bike culture have some bias toward some of the vehicles. That would not surprise me. I'd love to read some research on that, because I don't think I have seen any of this. Actually, because you mentioned the name of Calvin, let me ask you a cheeky question. One of your co-authors in this research is affiliated with Klein, which is also supported the funding of the research. Could you discuss how the research methodology maintain objectivity despite the industry connection?
Yeah, thanks for this cheeky question. So I should say that sort of about Lime has not provided monetary funding for any of these studies, right? So that's all come from, for the surveys or for other work, that's all come from Anne and me and my universities. Obviously, Calvin is involved in the survey, so they're providing some in-kind contributions in the term, sometimes with his labor, sometimes not. It's something we've talked a lot about. We want our work to be able to sort of be viewed as rigorous, right? And so we've often tried to do what's called pre-registration, where we sort of write up what we're going to do and what our analysis plan will be beforehand. We've tended to have Anne and I do all the data collection or manage the data collection and analysis. Not always, but we've tried to do that to sort of create these barriers so that it's not, so to try and limit the perceived or actual biases when it is there. But of course, obviously, like, we're collaborating with Calvin at Lime, and so I'm not going to say that there's no way that any influence happened without that. So I think that is always something we should acknowledge, and we try to acknowledge that in our work. And we would hope and want people to replicate our work, right? So we try to put our code out there and our data out there, and we want other people to do similar research and find out, like, do you find something similar, or do you find something totally different? We always encourage that.
I appreciate the response to it. Thank you. There were a question in the audience that actually echo one that I had in mind, and probably also might be linked to some of your future research. But I'd like to explore with you how you're finding might apply to other forms of micromobility beyond shared e-scooter. So do you see any ways that some of the approach that you're using could be replicable and applicable, I guess, to bike share? And even further beyond that to personal, scooter or bike?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think that many of the parking regulations that we recommend and ways we think about parking would have co-benefits, right? They're not just, and we hope that anything that we're recommending for sort of how we can think about and implement parking, we wouldn't want it to just be something that only is beneficial to people using certain brands or certain, shared scooter operations, right? Like, I think many of the things that we're thinking about, whether it's on-street corrals, anyone using a bike or scooter or other small device would probably be able to park there and would find benefits from doing so. So I think we think about it that way. I think one of the things we're really curious about with that upcoming research that we're doing is sort of whether there are differences in sort of perceptions, right, between bikes and scooters. And I don't know the answer to that. I suspect that there are, that sort of when people see a bike parked in some way, they might look at it differently than a scooter. One of the things I didn't talk about in those perceptions earlier is this idea of, that scooters are new and that there's something that people are not as used to. And so that might be affecting the perceptions as well. And other people have written about this and talked about this, that like just that the fact that they are new and different means that people are more likely to pay attention to them versus bikes, which have been around for a long time, over 100 years, and cars as well. And so people are used to and have normalized the different ways those vehicles park, whereas scooters are relatively new technologies. And so people don't have a fixed idea about how they should and could be parked and how we regulate that.
And I look forward to sort of like see where the next step of your research and the team are going to. I know we are at time, but we still have one question I'd like to make sure that we are covering, if that's okay. So thanks for everyone for staying with us. I think this is a fantastic conversation. So Trevor Thomas is asking, and I'm going to quote exactly because there's a different question in it. Is there a methodological issue in counting each scooter once? It seems like you're likely to get a fuller sample of scooters that have been sitting in place for a long time versus those who are dropped off, rented quickly. And long stay scooters are more likely to have been operated, deployed where they observed, presumably in a more orderly fashion.
Yeah, so this is a great comment, and something we have talked a lot about. So when we have people collect data, we have them write down the ID number for the scooter and take a picture of it, right? So one of the things we're looking for is whether the same ID scooter appears multiple times in our database. And the question of like, when should we count it again, right? So if it's parked there on Thursday and it doesn't move and it's there again later on Thursday when someone collects data, right, we probably shouldn't count that scooter again. It would be double counting it as a misparked scooter or a properly parked scooter. But if it's parked there the second day, right, should that count as a new observation or a different observation? I forget how we dealt with that for different days. I think we counted it as a new observation the second day, but I'd have to go look at our code to see. But I think it's like an interesting methodological question about like, should it be counted twice or not? And also, it's pretty easy, as you note, Trevor, to note whether a park has been deployed by micromobility staff, right, or employees, right? You can see they're often very tidy when they're put out there the first time in the beginning of the day. You'll see a sort of a flock of scooters very organized and tidily put out. So it's pretty easy to tell that. And that's one of the reasons we can look at that with the photos and see those differences. We did try and do some analysis of video in a couple cities, but we haven't been able to get really good quality images to see sort of how it varies over a course of a day and what happens and where people are leaving them.
Thanks, Nick, and thanks, Trevor, for that question. All right, I think this closes our Q&A for today. Once again, thank you so much for staying a few more minutes, everyone, so we could hear some of Nick's feedback on that specific one. Thanks for taking the time today to be with us. Really appreciate all the questions, the conversation, and as I was mentioning, you'll receive a recap email with the recording, some of the summary in the coming, well, I guess tomorrow for most of it. So thanks, everyone. Have a great day or evening, I guess, for our European folks.